Welcome, everybody. I appreciate everybody being here. Thank you. My name is Larry Rosenthal. I am the chair of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. And I'd like to do a couple of things before we begin. One, cell phones. Please turn off your cell phones or check them if you think you've turned them off already. And otherwise, let's not have an interruption. I also want to announce our next event. Our next event will be with George Lakoff, who is the director of the Center for the Neural Mind and Society here at UC Berkeley. He's also a cognitive linguist and a professor of linguistics at the university. He's taught here since 1972, and he will talk about the present divide, what to do now. That talk will be on Tuesday, March 14th at the Bantow Auditorium of Sujardai Hall here at UC Berkeley. Today's event will have our standard format. Brian Fishman will speak for 45 minutes, and then we will open the floor up for questions and answers. And now it's a real pleasure to introduce Brian. I guess he makes me realize that I've been doing this for a while, but Brian is our first repeat speaker. And so it's an unusual pleasure to welcome him back. Brian Fishman is a counterterrorism research fellow at the International Studies Program at New America. He is also an affiliated scholar of the Center for Right-Wing Studies here at UC Berkeley, and he is an affiliate with Stanford University's Center on International Studies and Cooperation, and a fellow with Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. He holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia and a BA from UCLA. While teaching at West Point, Brian Fishman led a cutting-edge program to declassify data captured from al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of Iraq. He has also taught courses on terrorism and counterinsurgency at the United States Military Academy, Georgetown University, and Columbia University. He regularly appears in national and international media, testifies before Congress on issues related to terrorism. He is, in fact, the leading expert on ISIS and the author of numerous groundbreaking studies focusing on jihadi fighters in Iraq and Iranian military and political influence in Iraq. Brian Fishman served as the director of research at the United States Military Academy's Combating Terrorism Center and began studying the progenitors of ISIS in 2005. In 2008, he taught an academic course on the Islamic State's turn toward governance, and he predicted the rise of the Islamic State in early 2011, prior to the Syrian civil war. When cadets from that 2008 seminar, who are now Army officers, reached out in late 2014 asking for an update on the course syllabus, Brian was inspired to write the master plan. The master plan is Brian's newest book. It is recently published, and it provides the basis for his talk today. So please join me in welcoming Brian Fishman.
Well, thank you all for being here and for having me. Thanks to Larry, Christine, and Cynthia for organizing and making this happen. It's interesting to be here at the Center for Right-Wing Studies. It seems like no one would ever really need to study this. I don't know why it's so important these days that folks would want to study right-wing movements. It's incredibly apropos, obviously. I think with that framing, I think that you are undoubtedly, as I talk about the evolution of the Islamic State, especially in the way that it positions itself against al-Qaeda, and evolved from both in parallel and in conjunction with al-Qaeda. I think you will certainly draw parallels to other kinds of social movements, both violent ones and non-violent ones, and that may be interesting. The overarching argument that I'm going to make today is that the Islamic State is not new, that a lot of the discussion of this organization as a function of the Syrian civil war in 2014, when the media really started paying attention, when governments around the world started paying attention to it again, forgot some of that history, some of their history. And when you're studying a terrorist organization or any political movement, it's really important to understand how that movement understands itself. Because I had a professor in grad school, Dick Betts, and Dick Betts used to say, and sort of the classic army saying is, the enemy gets a vote. Well, the enemy gets a vote in this case too. The Islamic State's history of itself matters. It matters to the way that it is structured. It is a challenge in some respects to the way that we understand it. And it speaks to the group's resilience more than anything else. I'm going to argue today that the Islamic State has actually existed for a decade. And certainly that's how they understand themselves. They haven't been very strong for most of that period. But the tenure of this organization is longer than I think is commonly understood. And that tenure gives them a sense of resiliency. So just as they didn't appear as suddenly as many believe, they're not going to disappear as quickly as many hope. So where does this all begin? What is the master plan, right? I've got this sort of scary title, right, to the book, the master plan. The master plan is a document that was developed in late 2004 at a time when the godfather of the Islamic State, a man named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was a Jordanian. He was the emir of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Young guy, not of the same generation as Osama bin Laden and the leadership of al-Qaeda. People forget that al-Qaeda was just one of many militant jihadi organizations. There were 14 militant jihadi organizations that operated in Afghanistan on 9/11. Al-Qaeda was one of them. Most important, for sure, but it was only one. They didn't all agree with each other. One of those other organizations was a small movement led by this man, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He was supported financially by al-Qaeda. He was given logistical support by al-Qaeda. But he didn't join al-Qaeda because he was more extreme than al-Qaeda. And more extreme than the Taliban. He believed that both of those organizations were willing to accept what he considered religious innovation that was unacceptable. He thought that the Taliban were too accepting of Afghan tribal practices that he believed were un-Islamic. And things like decorating graves, for example, is sort of a classic example. But there are lots of others. Toleration of minority sects, Shia Muslims is another. Not that the Taliban were tremendously accommodating, but more so than Zarqawi would have liked. So there were a lot of issues there. But what happens is after 9/11, many of these jihadi organizations, which all had different views on how they should affect change, wind up getting pushed together. Under pressure, they sort of coalesce. But Zarqawi runs and flees Afghanistan, goes to Iraq, right? And in 2004, by 2004, remember the U.S. invaded Iraq in March of 2003. So Zarqawi, who was used and was held up in Secretary of State Colin Powell's famous presentation to the United Nations making the case for the invasion of Iraq. Zarqawi was held up as sort of, this is the al-Qaeda connection to the regime in Iraq. And it was true that Zarqawi was in Iraq. And it was true that Zarqawi was a jihadi. And it was true that he had taken funding from al-Qaeda. But it wasn't true that he was part of al-Qaeda. And we didn't really understand that distinction at the time. And this is not a defense of Zarqawi by any means. It's just to say that within this wider jihadi movement, there are lots of different factions. And they, from the outside, maybe they all seem similar. But from the inside, the differences among them really matter. Right? And And it was wrong to say that he was al-Qaeda at the time. He wasn't. He was an independent jihadi operator. But by 2004, he had become the most important foreign jihadi in Iraq. And he began to negotiate with al-Qaeda to formally join the organization. And to do that, they had to smooth over some of their differences. And the document that they came up with that represented a joint strategic plan was the master plan. And it was developed in late 2004 between this man Zarqawi and al-Qaeda's security chief. His name was Saif al-Adil. He was an Egyptian, former special forces officer. He was al-Qaeda's internal security chief. He was kind of a brutal man. He was the man that would try to torture answers out of al-Qaeda's enemies. But also a very practical man, not somebody that you would think of as an ideological diehard. He was actually against the 9/11 attacks. People forget this about al-Qaeda, but there was a major faction inside al-Qaeda that opposed the 9/11 attacks, because they thought it would precipitate an attack on the Taliban in Afghanistan that would deny them the safe haven that they'd had there. So in 2004, Saif al-Adil, representing bin Laden's sort of worldview, and Zarqawi begin a negotiation over what a unified movement is going to look like. And what that really means is to take al-Qaeda's strategic worldview, which was built around the idea that al-Qaeda was a tight, small organization that would partner with lots of other organizations in order to achieve change. And what that meant was that al-Qaeda sort of had two operating models. One was they thought they would work with other jihadi groups that were focused on overthrowing local governments. So they would work with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was focused on overthrowing the government of Libya. They would focus on Saudi organizations, focused on overthrowing the Saudi government. And al-Qaeda thought of themselves as like, we are going to help all of those organizations be more effective. And then they also thought, in 1996, in the late 1990s, al-Qaeda says, you know what, we're not going to be able to help these groups overthrow local governments if those local governments are backed by the United States. Right? So what we need to do is attack the United States. Right? That's the strategic thesis that al-Qaeda was operating under when they attacked us on 9/11. Right? Is if we attack the United States, we can separate the U.S. from these local governments. We can raise the cost of doing business for the U.S. so that they abandon those local governments, and then our partners can overthrow those local governments, and eventually we can build up a caliphate in their place. A caliphate being a transnational sort of Islamic state. Al-Qaeda understood that might take decades, could take centuries, might take a really long time. They didn't have a sort of a clear timeline associated with this idea. But that was the vision, is this sort of long time frame. Zarqawi was not willing to accept a long time frame. Zarqawi was a man of action. He wanted to attack local governments, attack them in the near term, create real change fast. And he wasn't so concerned. Al-Qaeda felt that the leadership in the Islamic world, in the Muslim world of these states, was corrupt. But Al-Qaeda thought that the lay people, maybe they had strayed from what Al-Qaeda considered the true vision of Islam, which is not at all representative of what most Muslims believe. But that's what Al-Qaeda thought. Al-Qaeda wanted to win those people over. Al-Qaeda thought to itself, we're going to win over the Ummah, the grand Ummah of 1.6 billion people around the world. We're going to kill the leaders. But most of these people, we're going to try to lead them back to the true path, as Al-Qaeda understood it. Zarqawi didn't think that way. Zarqawi said, well, there are some people out there that are true Muslims, and there are some people that are not. They're apostates. They don't agree with me, therefore they're apostates, and they deserve to die. And the problem, as Zarqawi diagnosed it, was how do I differentiate between those two categories of people? And his vision was, I am going to use violence so brutal, so extraordinary, that it is going to force people to pick a side. Right? And even though most people, especially most Muslims, are going to reject that violence, at least then I'll know who's with me and who's against me. Right? So these are two very different visions for how to approach the world, even within the jihadi movement. Right? Zarqawi's is much more exclusive. The master plan that they come up with tries to bridge that gap. And what it says is, and they developed this in 2004, is they said, well, we're going to have a 7-stage plan. That 7-stage plan, we're going to sort of backdate it to begin in 2000 with the planning for the 9/11 attack. And it's going to end in 2020 with the destruction of Israel and and sort of a globe-spanning caliphate that can assert authority, our authority around the globe. The most important stage was stage 5. And stage 5 was, and remember they said this in 2004, stage 5 was to take place between 2013 and 2016, and it was to say a caliphate will be redeclared in Syria during this time period. It also said that during this time period, the British would reject the rising unity of Europe, which is true. So there's sort of like, so I throw out that timeline because it always gets this kind of like, puzzled look from people in an audience when you mention this timeline. The timeline is probably luck that they got that right, right? We shouldn't over-index on the timeline. It's great if you're an author and you're trying to grab people's attention because people pay attention to it. But it's probably luck. What's most important about that timeline and stage 5, the stage of declaring the state, the statement that they're going to redeclare the caliphate in Syria, is the designation of Syria. Why Syria? What in 2004, a decade before the Islamic State was sort of widely recognized in Syria, why did they say Syria is the place where we can do this? Especially there's this insurgency going on in Iraq. But yet in 2004, they recognized Iraq was not the place where they would do this. It would be Syria where the opportunity was. Right? Why? Well, a big part of this was a recalibration of al-Qaeda's assumptions, geopolitical assumptions about how the world worked. Right? Remember, al-Qaeda said, we're going to attack the United States because we have to sever the United States from propping up these local regimes we don't like. But in 2004, there was this prime example that the U.S. wasn't going to prop up every local regime. We just knocked over the regime in Iraq. Right? And so this basic geopolitical assumption that al-Qaeda had built a strategy around had been challenged a bit. Right? The U.S. wasn't going to prop up every regime in the Middle East. Some it would let go. Some it might overthrow. And what they saw in 2004 was that in Iraq, though, the demographics were against them. Iraq is a 65% Shia country. The Jihadi movement is overwhelmingly Sunni. There are minor exceptions. It's a Sunni movement. It's split. Iraq is split between Arabs and Kurds. The Jihadis believe that they sort of cross ethnic lines, but in practice they've had a hard time doing that often. And they basically look at Iraq. The al-Qaeda leadership especially looks at Iraq and says, you know what? This is not the place to start because the demographics are against us. Syria, though, they looked at and they said, Syria is a country the U.S. isn't going to prop up. Right? It's a country that has had hostile relationships with the U.S. They interpreted Syria's opposition to Israel in particular. The al-Qaeda said, well, the Americans won't prop up the Syrian regime because they will believe it's in Israel's interest to let the regime fall. And the demographics in Syria are in our favor. It's a primarily Sunni country led by a small minority dominated by Alawites, which is a sort of fascinating theology that combines elements of Christianity and Islam, and it's really kind of interesting. But from al-Qaeda's perspective and the Zarqawi's perspective, they're apostates for sure, right? And so there is this notion in 2004, Syria is the place we're going to do this, right? And so how does that plan go? So it says, I won't go through every stage, but it basically goes and says, well, we're going to bait the United States into attacking us. We're going to bog them down in Iraq. We are going to bleed them of energy. We're going to use that opportunity to build up our base of support. We are going to infiltrate the Levant. We are, between 2013 and 2016, we are going to start essentially a civil war in Syria. We are going to establish the Caliphate there, after which we will go on a campaign of global terrorism unlike the world has ever seen, which kind of happened. That's stage 6. And stage 7, as they understand it, which would happen, now basically, is that the U.S. would cease to back Israel, and the jihadis would be able to destroy it. And that's sort of where the plan stops. But the implication is essentially you would have this, caliphate growing in strength, no Israel, and the ability to project power not just in Syria but further afield across the Middle East. That's the master plan. Now, so I pointed out some of the elements of the master plan that are really smart, right? The identification of Syria as a location, pretty smart. The timeline turned out to be right in some respects. Other elements were wrong. Probably more luck than skill to get the big time frame right. But what actually happened? Because what you've got here is you've got a time frame. You've got a plan, a strategic alliance, and a strategic plan that was built for an alliance between the Zarqawiyist movement and al-Qaeda that no longer exists. Right? Today, in Syria, the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, and the al-Qaeda affiliates there are effectively at war with one another. And so why did this happen? What happened? And I've hinted at it to a bit. Some of it is just personality, right? They're just it's about power. Who's going to be in control? And we forget about that within terrorist organizations a lot, that they're just human beings that run these things, and they're big personalities, and oftentimes they don't like each other. And that's part of it. But a big part of it is ideology, and the way that ideology was sort of transmuted into the application of violence in Syria, in that context. And a lot of that, in my mind, is the way that these two organizations understand their constituency. I mentioned this before. Al-Qaeda thinks that its constituency is the vast majority of the world's Muslims, that they're ultimately going to win over the vast majority of those people. Now, in practice, that is not going to happen, right? Al-Qaeda's ideology is still very violent. Al-Qaeda kills way more Muslims than anybody else. And their kind of grandiose hope to win over the Ummah, I think, is just that. But the fact that they want to win over all of those people means they want to mitigate the level of civilian casualties among local populations. It means they don't want to celebrate, beheading Muslims, for example, and brutal killings of other Muslims. They want to fight them when necessary, but they don't want to celebrate that kind of violence. The Islamic State, in contrast, because they define their constituency much, much smaller, and they believe that most of that wider community of 1.6, 1.7 billion people are not actually Muslims. They're apostates from the Islamic State's perspective. And so it doesn't matter if you piss them off. In fact, if you piss them off, they'll reveal themselves as the enemies that they truly are. And then at least you know who to kill. And so that leads to very different operational approaches on the ground in Syria, right? Where the Al-Qaeda affiliates have worked to collaborate and work closely with other kinds of militant groups in Syria, whereas the Islamic State has essentially said, you're either with us or you're against us. That's how we know. That's how we know whether you're a good guy or a bad guy. You either join our organization or you do not. Now, another way to think about this, and again, you guys could, you could think this in sort of Leninist models. You could do this in a lot of different ways, right? Al-Qaeda historically thought of itself as a very small organization, 200 people on 9/11. But they built alliances with lots of other organizations. They thought of themselves as a small elite organization. They would build alliances with lots of other organizations to pursue their grand goals. The Islamic State had a much more exclusivist, has a much more exclusivist ideology, but thought of itself as a much more populist organization. If you want to join, you can join. If you show up and say, I'm part of the Islamic State, then the Islamic State's perspective is, okay, well, you're demonstrating that you're a true Muslim, therefore you're in. Right? There's a place for you here. Al-Qaeda wasn't really like that in terms of joining the organization. So So you've got very different sort of operational models between these two groups. And that leads to some of the splits. Now, why does this matter, right? Why did I teach a class about the so-called Islamic State in 2008? What did I see at that time, right? Why did I think it was relevant for the cadets at West Point? Well, what I saw was that in October of 2006, the organization that Zarqawi had created in Iraq, which was then known as al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Zarqawi was killed in June of 2006, but in October of 2006, they declared themselves the Islamic State of Iraq. And very clearly at the time say, and we are going to govern. We are not just changing our name, we are going to govern. They named a cabinet that included all sorts of things, like a Ministry of Fisheries. They touted public works projects that they did. They set speed limits in the places they controlled. They picked up garbage in places that they controlled. They created many of the affectations of a state that we've come to associate with the so-called Islamic State in more recent years. So why don't we think about them as being an entity that was created in 2006? Right? So why don't we think about them in those terms? And why does it matter that we sort of would look back and think about them as having declared a state in 2006 as opposed to in 2013, 2014, depending on when you want to start the more recent clock? Well, first off, it matters because they think it matters, right? They think they declared themselves a state in 2006, and they think they've survived since then. Therefore, they think they can survive into the future, right? Especially under military pressure, right? The Islamic State today is losing militarily. They are losing territory in Syria and Iraq, right? What gives them confidence that they can survive? Well, because they believe that they've survived in the past, right? They believe that they declared a state in 2006. The U.S. surge, you guys probably remember the surge of troops into Iraq in 2007, 2008, 150,000 Americans, plus an effort to get local tribes to rise up against what we called al-Qaeda in Iraq, but which called itself the Islamic State of Iraq at the time. And that worked. That military pressure worked. You put 150,000 American soldiers somewhere, they're going to do a lot of damage against whoever they're fighting. And they did. The Islamic State of Iraq, when it was declared in late 2006, had maybe 15,000 fighters. When you fast forward to late 2010, early 2011, they had about 1,000 fighters, right? So there was tremendous sort of military progress against them. They didn't really control territory anymore. And this is why we don't think about that previous incarnation of an Islamic State as a state, because it didn't really last very long. They got their butts kicked by 150,000 U.S. troops, a bunch of special forces guys, and local tribal action, right? That's a very expensive way to do that kind of damage. But 150,000 Americans will do that. Then something sort of funny happens, right? In 2011, the Department of Defense thought two things simultaneously. And you can see this in the public statements. We said they have between 800 and 1,000 members, the Islamic State of Iraq, and they are militarily defeated. Now, military defeat is a term of art for folks in the Department of Defense and for professional soldiers. But I want to challenge that definition a little bit and the way that we think about it a little bit, because 800 to 1,000 people, fighters, members, seems like a lot less than 15,000, as it was a few years before. They couldn't hold territory anymore. They had to operate like a mafia. They ran protection rackets to raise money. They took over local gas stations and concrete plants to raise money. They spent a lot of time assassinating leaders they didn't like. They would conduct terrorist attacks that were very vibrant. So between 2008 and 2010, there were more suicide attacks in Iraq than any other country in the world. Remember, that was the time period when we were defeating this organization, when they were no longer the insurgent organization we thought of them as. But they were still a vibrant terrorist organization. And I think this is how you can think there were 1,000 members and they were militarily defeated, because you weren't thinking about them as a terrorist group, like in a traditional terrorist model. You're thinking about them as an insurgency, as something that was that was trying to win over the population and represent a more conventional military threat. Because 800 to 1,000 members is a lot less than 15,000, but it's 4 to 5 times what al-Qaeda had on 9/11. They had fewer than 200 members on 9/11. And so that's the dynamic. And this is one of the reasons why I bring that up, is that the Islamic State today is losing again. They are losing again, militarily on the ground. But we've got to be very careful not to sort of define them into defeat when they aren't actually defeated. And I think that's partially what we did the last time. And that kind of mistake, in my mind, is one of the things that allowed them to be resurrected, right? When you go back, there was a debate at the beginning of the Syrian civil war, right? In 2011, the protest movement against Bashar al-Assad, utterly legitimate protest movement, clearly recognizing that you've got an authoritarian government that kills and tortures arbitrarily. But almost immediately, if you go back and you look at what the Islamic State what called itself the Islamic State of Iraq at the time, in April of 2011, the protest movement was brand new. And the Islamic State of Iraq was saying, we are going to help our brothers and sisters in Syria. And so what I would say is that we didn't catch up as a global community to the fact that this organization was really dangerous until the middle of 2014. But if you think about that history again with a different frame, that there was a very strong terrorist organization with 800 to 1,000 members literally right next door, that early history of the Syrian civil war looks a little bit different. It doesn't lead you to any clear policy outcomes. There are still no good policy options, some of us know. But I think it reframes the way that fight happened. That there was a very strong organization trying to undermine, that had survived the best the U.S. military could throw at it. An organization that had survived that was trying to co-opt and undermine and own the Syrian conflict from the very, very, very beginning. And we just didn't think about it that way at the time, and we still don't think about it that way. But that's what the Islamic State was trying to do. That's what the people that called themselves the Islamic State were trying to do. And when they tell their history today, they count it back to 2006. Now, one of the reasons why the present-day Islamic State folks sort of refer their history back to 2006 is that they're trying to explain that they're different than al-Qaeda. Because there's been this great fallout between the Islamic State leadership and al-Qaeda. And I talked about that breakdown and the fact that they're fighting. But these two organizations really do have different ways of thinking about how they're going to achieve political change, the appropriate use of violence, how they should interact with local populations. And we have to understand those differences when we think about not just jihadi groups, not just the Islamic State and al-Qaeda, but all terrorist organizations. It's one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of the sort of radical Islamic terrorism frame that we hear sometimes, right? And the reason is that kind of frame, now most of the time when you hear criticism of that frame, it's because of the notion that Islam is at the center of it. We don't want to denigrate Islam generally, and certainly not Muslims generally. And I think that's a legitimate critique. That's not the critique I'm going to make right now. The critique I'm going to make is that the problem with that kind of framing is that it's way too general. What does it mean? If you use that kind of framing, you're conflating Hezbollah and Hamas and al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and Saudi Arabia and Iran, potentially, all into a single frame. That doesn't actually lead you to any useful analytical observations that will help you construct countermeasures, whether they're military countermeasures or diplomatic countermeasures or development countermeasures or any of that, right? That kind of generalization based on a very, very broad ideological frame actually doesn't help that much, right? In fact, I would say that it hurts more than it helps because it creates the illusion of analytical specificity when you really don't have it. And so that's my criticism, and I think we really have to look these organizations right in the eye for what they really are trying to accomplish in order to think about how you undermine them. And that means getting into the nitty-gritty of what they are. So one of the things, just to go back to the book for a minute, one of the things that that I really enjoyed in the book and that I think is unique about the master plan is I use a ton of internal documents from inside al-Qaeda and the Islamic State over time. And those really came from three sources that I think people find interesting. One is, as I said, I've been studying these people since 2005 when I showed up at West Point at the Combating Terrorism Center to teach. And what we did then is all these guys were using the internet then. They were using the internet very effectively, right? That's another story that we sort of imagine is this new thing that these groups just sort of showed up on social media. And it's true that they use social media. But they've been using the internet effectively since I've been doing this. And their material was always there, but it was 2 or 3 clicks away, 2, 3, 4 clicks away, instead of you just stumbling across it on Twitter, right? And for a while there, you could just stumble on the Islamic State material and propaganda on Twitter. And more importantly, journalists could just stumble on it on Twitter and then amplify it because it was an easy story. But that's been happening for a long time. So what I did then was use a computer program to download entire websites, all of the content on them, scrape those websites of all these jihadi sites. And so I had all of this historical information on these groups. Now most of that was garbage, but one of the things that I found in that old repository was a document written in 2005 by the organization that the current leader of the Islamic State ran then. He was the ideological leader of this organization. And I didn't realize it. I honestly didn't realize it until I sat down while writing the book to go back through this stuff. And this was his name is Bakr Al Baghdadi. This was his organization in 2005. And he laid out a rough vision for how you build a state. That you build social institutions, you build economic institutions, you steal concepts from the West in order to build a robust state. And that was their doctrine in 2005. So the current Caliph, the leader of the Islamic State, laid out that vision in 2005 on his own. He wasn't the only one to do it. That was floating around in other circles among jihadis. But it's interesting that he did that. And I had that because they were using the internet then. The other source was data that was declassified, that was captured by U.S. Special Forces primarily, and declassified. Also, some in the raid on Osama bin Laden's safe house in Pakistan. And when I was at West Point, I ran a program to bring some of that kind of stuff out and make it available. We'd use it to inform curriculum for our cadets at West Point, but then we would just put the stuff online. It was really pretty amazing ability to do that. And to get insight into how these organizations think and what do they say when it's not for public consumption, but how do they actually operate. So you get, draft propaganda documents and accounting documents are oftentimes some of the most interesting. Where does an organization actually spend its money? Where does it actually get its money? That tells you a lot about what they prioritize, no matter what kind of organization it is. And we were able to look and see those kinds of things. The last sort of source of direct insight that I used in the book was, and this was one that I didn't know existed until I started writing the book, and it actually wasn't publicly available till I started writing the book, but was the evidence that was submitted at Guantanamo Bay for the trial of a guy named Abdul Hadi al-Iraqi, a senior al-Qaeda member. And I know there's a lot of very, very, very legitimate criticism of the prison in Guantanamo Bay. Abdul Hadi is one of the real al-Qaeda guys. And there are these trials going on. And so there's this huge repository of data that was declassified for that purpose. It was put online and nobody noticed it. This was one of my great fears while I was writing the book, was that somebody else was going to discover that information and publish on it before I did. But nobody did. And it was, and that was amazing insight into some of the early relationships among these groups in Afghanistan, and then in the early days of the Iraq insurgency, how the back and forth occurred between these organizations. So those are the big pieces of it. I think the takeaway from all this, and what I'll leave you with before we do questions, is the importance of recognizing that this is not going to go away anytime soon, and therefore we need to have a strategy that is sustainable, and that is that sort of level sets the actual threat that these groups pose. They are very dangerous, but it's far more likely that I'm going to die in a car crash driving home tonight than that I'm going to be killed by a terrorist or anyone else there, right? And that was true 10 years ago. It's true today. And we have to understand and sort of level set that threat. I, like most folks, still think terrorism is more scary than driving. But we have to be very cognizant of that emotional sort of reality and the way that we are manipulated by this form of political activism. I think we also have to recognize very, very clearly what a minority these groups are among the sort of global community of Muslims, right? There is a lot of rhetoric that inflates their reach. I think that rhetoric is dangerous. In 2009, a colleague of mine at West Point, they did a study looking at who were the victims of al-Qaeda. And they found that 84% of al-Qaeda's victims, this is outdated at this point. This number is lower than it would be today. That 84% of al-Qaeda's victims were Muslim, right? And so we have to understand that painting with a very broad brush a religious community that is incredibly diverse, of 1.7 billion people, because of the actions of a very tiny minority, is, in my view, really misguided. Not just from a moral standpoint, though that as well, but just from a straight up analytical standpoint, and ultimately a strategic standpoint. The last piece of this is sort of a legal one. There are Americans in the fight in Iraq and Syria today, and they are risking their necks. And regardless of whether we think they should be there, they should be operating under a legal framework that we think is appropriate. Our engagement against the Islamic State today is justified legally based under the authorization for use of military force that was passed against al-Qaeda in 2001 to justify the attack against the Taliban in Afghanistan. I would argue, now legal experts, I'm not a lawyer, say that is legally appropriate. That seems like a stretch to me, but I'm not a lawyer. But what I know is that is not politically viable, right? If we are sort of squeezing through a military action, a strategy against an organization as dangerous and as resilient as the Islamic State, but we aren't willing to have a national debate about what we're willing to commit to it and have our elected leaders vote on that one way or the other, we are wrong. We are broken, and we won't actually win over the long run. It's a recipe for fighting. It's not a recipe for winning. And I think that is really dangerous, and it speaks to in my mind, the corruption of our, and not the corruption in a sort of euphemistic sense, of the way we debate hard things in the United States. And the reason why I say that is that I think both hawks and doves don't want to actually have that debate and that vote in the Congress. The hawks don't want to have that vote because they don't want to vote, again, to authorize force in what might be perceived as like, let's go invade Iraq again. Right? Because nobody wants to do that. The doves don't want to have that debate because they don't want to vote against an authorization of force against an organization as virulent and truly hateful and evil as ISIS. And that's a problem. That is a problem because what that means is that we are still sending Americans to kill and die, but we're doing so under a legal framework that was passed in 2001 to target an organization that the Islamic State is actually at war with. Right? It's really weird and ironic, and it's not the basis for a strategy that is going to be winning. And I think that's a real problem. You know, it's very, very hard to go out and say we are going to win a strong fight when we are standing on a foundation that is very shaky. And setting aside the sort of broader political turmoil we live in at the moment, we haven't done our due diligence here to do what I think is necessary legally, or go through a political process to actually build a foundation for a sustainable strategy, to actually have that debate internally as a country about what we're willing to do about the Islamic State. You know, I don't think anybody wants to go invade Iraq again. But we haven't really had that national debate about whether we want U.S. soldiers in Syria and Iraq today. We should have that debate, you know, because if we're not willing to do it, then we shouldn't have them there. And if we are willing to do it, then we should make sure that we have enough and we've committed the right resources to it. And I think it is a great disservice to the people that are actually put out there killing and dying that we haven't had that conversation. We should do it. And so I realize that diverges a little bit from the discussion of the Islamic State, but it is part of the book, and I think it's important, and it speaks to a broader set of challenges that we face. So, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Okay, why don't we start over here?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
The first, just one little thing, one major thing, and that is that the School of the Americas, maybe you've heard about in Georgia,
Yeah.
for many, many years they've trained the militaries of countries in Central and South America, which some of them turned into death squads,
Yeah.
and literally, so the CIA was training and financing these death squads, which hundreds of thousands of people died.
Yeah.
And during all this time, and for other reasons, I've heard the U.S. being called a terrorist country right here in Berkeley many times. So we always call Iraq or
Yeah.
you know, people terrorists. We have to look here too.
Yeah.
But my question is, what is positive or what is negative about U.S. U.S. vision and involvement? And also, what is negative? What is positive? What's negative?
About our involvement right now?
In all these,
Yeah.
in the Mideast.
Yeah, I think. So I think the positive piece of this is that the Islamic State really isn't. It is not a popular movement. They are a minority movement that is oppressing a lot of people. Maybe 50,000 foreign fighters have gone to Syria to fight in the last 3 years. That's a gargantuan number in historical terms, right? The best estimates on how many foreign fighters went to fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan is, maximum 20,000, but probably closer to 10,000. So the number of people that have gone to Syria is really a different scale. That said, and some people say, well, that just shows how popular the Islamic State is. Well, that's not true. 6 million people have fled Syria because they're terrified of this organization and the Assad government, right? And so I think the most positive thing that we can be doing is working with local partners to enable them to push back on the Islamic State and to support the refugees. We're obviously having this rancorous debate in the U.S. about refugees and how we're going to approach refugee policy. We talk a lot about what Europe is going to do and the challenges that Europe faces, and those are really compared to the debate we're having. The debate in Europe is much more real because the numbers are just so much bigger, right? I mean, just scale creates challenges. But forgotten in all of that is that the overwhelming majority of the refugees from Syria are in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, in countries that have far less capacity to deal with these challenges. I think there is a component here where we need to be providing military support to folks in the region. But I think we also need to be, there's essentially no amount of money is too much to help the Jordanians, support the refugee population in their country so that there isn't instability as a function of these people, right? And which is not a denigration against these people, but if you bring 1.5 million people into a country of 4.5 million, it's a huge strain, right? And there's hope. People have this, everybody always thinks, well, the refugees will go home someday. They never go home. It just doesn't work that way. Like, people wind up getting somewhere and home winds up being a destroyed city. And so we got to build, one of the things we need to do is we need to prepare in these places for sort of long-term, as ugly as it is, I think we have to do.
Do you see anything negative in our development?
Oh yeah, of course. I think there's I think we have sent very mixed signals in our policy. I think, and I supported President Obama very much. I think he was a good president. I think he sent very mixed signals in Syria, and I think it was problematic on a lot of levels. I think drawing red lines and not enforcing them is really dangerous. You just shouldn't draw them if you're not going to enforce them. Like we shouldn't be bluffing in international relations. And I think we did a little bit, and we got called on it, and that's a problem. I think that the aid that we've given to a variety of actors, as much as I think we have tried to vet those actors, a lot of that guns and money has spilled into hands that we'd probably rather not have it. And I think that the original invasion of Iraq, we wouldn't have the Islamic State today if not for the original invasion of Iraq. It's the great sin of the last 20 years, and maybe one of the certainly the biggest foreign policy blunder of my lifetime, probably of anybody's lifetime in this room. Even I would argue even when you consider Vietnam, though I don't remember that era, so it's a little easier for me to make that argument potentially. But I would argue that the fallout from the invasion of Iraq is worse than the fallout from the invasion of Vietnam. Yeah.
Martin.
Yeah, I have a question. It has to do with, I think some of the argument. It seems to me that one of the problematic things with what you're saying is that in the book and what you've given us is a very clear understanding that one side has of what it means to win.
Yeah.
But what you haven't given us, and what would be very difficult to give us, and what you want us even to debate about, is what it would mean to win on our side. Because you've given us all the evidence, one, that shows us we can't get rid of them. And on the other hand, you've given us this evidence that says that we need a long-term strategy.
Yeah.
So when Congress asked me about the issue of gangs, and what I thought was the answer to gangs, I said they'll never be able to get rid of it. So you and I are now together on that point.
Yeah.
But then he said they asked me this question: And I said, well, what would you think would be the win on gangs? And I said, to an acceptable level, a number, I even said, an acceptable number of deaths predicated by gangs. Now, what I'd like to hear from you, since you're the expert on this, what would you consider to be the acceptable level for winning?
That's a great question. It's a really hard question. As you know, it's a well-formulated question to put me on the spot. It's a totally fair question. I don't know that I would put this in terms of an acceptable level of deaths. I think the way that I would frame it is an inability to, well, maybe I flipped it around. And I think what's acceptable is that these organizations are not strong enough to prevent clear sovereignty on behalf of the states in the region. That you need to have sovereign government across this territory, and that is the bare minimum for what is acceptable. Now, I think that in some ways that still leaves some things that we would really not like. I think that even if the Iraqi state and it's easy for me. Well, it's not easy, but I can envision the Iraqi state controlling the territory of Iraq again. It's very hard for me to envision the Syrian state controlling the Syrian territory again. So I think this is much harder on the Syrian side. But some sort of sovereign entity that operates within the bounds of the international system, controlling all of the territory. And an alternative to that, what is not acceptable on the ground, is that this territory starts to look like the Fatah and the Northwest Frontier provinces in Pakistan, where you've got ostensible sovereignty, but you've got an inability to govern with the effectiveness necessary to prevent the sort of large-scale operation of militant organizations that can plan terrorist attacks elsewhere. And I think that, unfortunately, I don't see us getting there anytime soon. Primarily because of Syria and the complexities of what it's going to take to govern Syria again. But that, to me, is the fundamental issue. Is you've got to be able to govern those places so that you actually turn this into a domestic law enforcement and intelligence problem again. Think of all the things I've just left out, right? I've left out human rights. That's down to the bare minimum, right? I've left out doing the kinds of things to root these kinds of organizations out from being mafias. That's getting us back to where we were in 2009 in Mosul, where you had the Islamic State of Iraq operating as a mafia, still doing a lot of terrorist attacks, right? In 2009, the Islamic State of Iraq killed 10% of the Iraqi foreign ministry on one day. Nobody remembers. Nobody cared. One of the great failures of that time period, actually, and it's important because we talk so much about media and journalism today, is one of the reasons why we don't remember the virulence that the Islamic State of Iraq still held during that time period is because the foreign journalists left Iraq, right? As the U.S. troops drew down and it was no longer as important here, the foreign journalists left. It also became harder for them to report. It became more dangerous. So the bureaus declined. You got reporting based on governing changes in Baghdad rather than what was happening on the street in various places. A lot of the military attacks, weren't covered. And so that was a real problem. But I think that's the baseline. That's the baseline for success. If you're going to get any farther than that, you need some kind of real pushback that is a sustainable solution for refugees that have fled Syria, especially in Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria, or Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, because that's where the next generation of these guys is going to come from. And we need to be able to head off the circular process of sort of mutual radicalization that we see, especially in Europe right now, between sort of incoming refugee flows real vibrant jihadi movements in some sort of urban centers in Europe, and a sense of real right-wing nationalism that Larry can probably speak to better than I can, but that is coming. That of right-wing terrorism. And I know folks here probably think about that potentially in the U.S. context. I would say Europe, it's even bigger issue. But that's my take. And I don't know that's a how do we solve that problem? I don't know how we solve that problem.
Thanks for the compelling talk. I especially appreciate your argument against the term radical Islam. I hadn't thought of that as a third term, and I'm convinced just by listening. I have 3 questions.
That's one.
I have 3 questions, but I'll ask 2. I'm wondering about can you give more description of the method that you use in terms of scraping the websites? Like, how do you get the selection of them? What program do you use? Parse it?
I used an ancient program called HTT Web. Because remember, this was a decade ago, right? There are much better scraping programs today, I'm sure, which I don't really use. I don't really do that so much anymore. It was called HTT Web. And it was basically, you would identify the domain and it would run through all of the sort of subdomains and pull them down into a file and download all the HTML. Very useful for just archiving sites over time. Now when you want to go back to those time periods, the best tool is actually hosted in San Francisco. It's called archive.org, the Wayback Machine. Anybody uses it? There is so much terrorist material on archive.org. And it's really useful for a researcher, but it's also a place where contemporary terrorists host things on servers in San Francisco all the time so that their buddies can find them, right? Because they're sustainable. When the Islamic State puts something out today, oftentimes it will be uploaded directly to archive.org, and Google and a bunch of other places as well. But those dynamics are, you can still find that stuff. You can still go back and actually look at a lot of these sites in 2005 because Archive has them, and I did that too during the research process.
You use archive.org?
I did, yeah, absolutely.
Do you buy the Daily Beast thesis that ISIS is a puppet of the Assad regime, and the related point that ISIS can't be defeated till Assad is gone?
So there's sort of 2 complementary theories. One is that ISIS was created by former Baathists from the Saddam Hussein regime, right? Or that it's not so much that it was created by them, but it was co-opted by them. And it's true that there are all these former Iraqi military officials that have risen up in the ranks of the Islamic State, right? So there is something to that. You go back to the very first attacks by the Islamic State, by the Zarqawists and the predecessors in 2003, after the U.S. invasion. Many of them were done in conjunction with Iraqi army officials, right? So that's true. But I don't buy that argument because I think that the entire organization has framed itself around its grandiose ideological goals. And I also think that the Iraqi army was infiltrated by a bunch of jihadis going way back. And then many of them, even if they weren't true jihadis when they started the insurgency in 2004, when you fight for a decade, your mind can change about a hell of a lot of things, right? So I think that there is a thesis that this is fundamentally a Baathist, that this is kind of a Baathist front. I don't really buy that argument. Though I do think there are a bunch of Baathists in the organization. The other thing is that the Assad regime favor the Islamic State? Well, I published a piece in 2012 that basically made the argument that this was before people realized the jihadis were in Syria. And I basically said, here's the evidence, the jihadis are in Syria. And over the long run, this is going to benefit the Assad regime. And it has benefited the Assad regime, I think, in a lot of ways, because it has divided the opposition to the Assad regime. It's also true that the Assad regime, during the U.S., major U.S. presence in Iraq, the Assad regime looked the other way, and in some cases facilitated the entry of jihadis into Iraq to fight U.S. troops. It's also true, if you go back even farther, that the Assad regime in Syria, which supported a wide range of Palestinian movements, for example, right? They supported Hamas for a while, they supported a bunch of other folks, But they also supported jihadis, because what they didn't want is they didn't want the Palestinian movements getting too powerful, right? And so if you support the jihadis break up everybody because they wind up turning on everyone. They don't buy into the nationalist stuff. And so it's true that the Assad regime supported jihadis at various times in order to try to undermine these other movements to make sure that they didn't oppose them. That said, it's also true that the Iranians facilitated, right? When I said the master plan itself was developed on an Iranian military base where Saif al-Adil was under a house arrest. That doesn't mean that Iran agrees with the jihadis ideologically. They don't. They don't. The jihadis hate Iran because it is a Shia government. And the Iranians also back these Shia militias that are doing much of the fighting against the Islamic State. Same thing with the Assad regime, right? So it's true that at times these governments have provided some assistance to jihadis. I think it's undeniable. I think we want to deny it sometimes because it's fuzzy about what it implies, about where do we go once you know that. Well, I think where it goes is that we have to recognize that the Middle East is really dirty and everybody plays dirty. And if we are going to operate in the Middle East, we are going to be sucked into playing dirty too, because everybody else is. And so one answer is don't play the game. And I think that's one answer. But I think the Assad regime is I think the Islamic State will survive even if the Assad regime went away tomorrow. That's what I think. Because I think the opposition to the Assad regime is so divided that they're, regardless of Assad, that they wouldn't be able to turn on the Islamic State anyway. That's what I think.
Well, on that point, I want to press you on the whack-a-mole problem.
Yeah.
So you think about all the great variety and numbers of jihadi groups, including all the ones that are operational in Syria, but not just those, the ones that are around the world, some of which claim to swear allegiance to either ISIS or al-Qaeda, whatever,
Yeah.
which doesn't necessarily actually mean very much. Doesn't even mean that necessarily they have great unity of command themselves. So you think al-Shabaab in Somalia is,
Right. Yeah.
So the question is this, what conclusions do you draw from the fact that you take a close look at the sort of ideological and maybe tactical differences between, let's say, al-Qaeda affiliated groups in Syria and ISIS? And what difference does it make, really? Because, there are a lot of people now think that as ISIS is getting, pressed back, it's, a lot of these semi-autonomous jihadi groups just switch loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, you have all this morphing going on in Idlib,
Yep.
and probably,
Yep.
fighters going from the ISIS-controlled areas that
Yep.
may end up in other places. So, it's this whack-a-mole issue. And does it really matter to, bore in deeply to these, tactical, ideological differences?
Yeah, I think that's a good challenge. Because it's absolutely true that those differences matter a lot more when you analyze analysis of terrorist groups. It's tended to happen largely on two levels, and sometimes three, but at an organizational level, and then at an individual level, right? So oftentimes, if you look at what happened, why do people do suicide bombings, right? There's a different question: why does a person use suicide bombings? Why do they sign up for it? Versus why does an organization decide to use that as a tactic, right? So different questions. And I think the argument that I've been making is a very organizational one, right? Is the clash between these organizations. Because we have seen, not just in Syria, where you get a bunch of jihadis that have tried to sign up for al-Qaeda in Syria, or al-Qaeda affiliate groups in Syria, they tend to be more restrictive in the mode of who they're going to let in. And then they switch and go over to the Islamic State, who lets just about anybody in, right? At least they used to. They've gotten more restrictive now because of the counterintelligence problem, right? Of vetting people. So I think you make a good point. I think but I think that these differences do matter because they impact how you communicate, how you expect these groups to operate. And therefore, how do you lay out their your sort of military operations as a result, but it also, and perhaps more importantly, suggests how do you need to confront them politically, right? I think if you're in confronting al-Qaeda affiliates in a place like Syria, you really need to think about, how do you build sort of rational competing alternatives for the groups that al-Qaeda has affiliated with, some of which have affiliated with al-Qaeda because they're strong. And al-Qaeda is willing to make an affiliation based on that basis. Whereas with the Islamic State, their adherents, that's not why they're there. That might be why they signed up originally, but most of them are more diehards. And so if you want to make a political argument against them, you've got to have a different kind of frame. The other piece of it is, and I didn't really talk about this, but this sort of populism of ISIS versus the elitism of al-Qaeda extends to who they deem as a credible messenger of a message, right? So al-Qaeda has always respected scholarship. They've respected leaders that they've respected academics that spend time in libraries thinking about things, right? And they say, for our most important decisions, we want to go to these learned people. And they've got these learned people that are jihadi. They're true jihadis. But they've made a choice, and that's the way they go. But they're very smart. They're very, very thoughtful. They think about things very hard. And the most important question that they think about is, which Muslims can I kill? Right? That's the most controversial question for them. And they go through a process of takfir, which is the declaration that somebody is not a Muslim, is a kafir, right? Al-Qaeda says, we're going to defer the responsibility for that decision to very learned people who are going to make very calculated decisions about very specific people or very specific groups of people. The Islamic State, with, again, its sense of populism, defers the authority for that decision to the people that it believes understand Islam the best. And the people that it believes understand Islam the best are walking in the path of God the most closely. And those are the people that are fighting on the front lines. So they're deferring authority for that kind of decision to the frontline fighter, not the learned person in the library. And what that means is that the Islamic State is at odds with itself, right? Because if Larry and I are in the Islamic State, and I think we should ally with Joel, and Larry says, no, Joel's an apostate, then Larry has the ability to not only kill Joel, but to kill me for my bad understanding of Joel. Right? You can see where the Islamic State's ideology, it really tears itself apart. Right? It doesn't scale very well. And they try to solve that problem by building an institution. But this is one of the things why I don't think the Islamic State is never going to have this global Spain caliphate, because it has this fundamental tension between its organizational goals and its organizational ethos, which is in some ways, I think, a better way to frame it than ideology. Right? Al-Qaeda doesn't have that same tension, but they've got this longer-term strategy. And yet, I take your point, and I think that leads to, if we want to undermine the Islamic State, you don't use some scholar to do it. You use some guy that's been there and got disillusioned and can point back at the group and say, those assholes aren't true Muslims. They're killing the weak. They're killing people that can't fight back. They're not really in it for religion. They're justifying evil with religion, and they convinced me for a while, but now I've seen the right path. You can fight al-Qaeda at an ideological level. I don't think you can do that with the Islamic State nearly as effectively. And so I think it does lead to different sort of tactical choices. That said, one of the real challenges here with where we are is, if you look sort of the aperture at Syria and Iraq, the Islamic State is losing right now. And President Obama said this in November of 2015. He said, Islamic State is losing. And then the Paris attacks happened a week later. And he looked, kind of silly saying that, right? So you pull back the aperture a little bit, and there were all these terrorist attacks, and now it doesn't look like the Islamic State is losing so much. If you pull back the aperture a bit further, and if we'd had this conversation in, December 2001, and the conversation then had been, well, in early 2017, we will be making military progress against this crazy jihadi movement that has taken over, a third of Iraq and a third of Syria. everybody would have thought it was nuts. We would have thought, no, there's no way that could possibly be the case. So when you look through it in that sense and aggregate those groups again, the trend doesn't look good over that 15-year time frame. So I take your point that the aperture that you look at this with really impacts the way you think about it.
All right. We have 5 minutes to go, and it seemed to me that there was a kind of an 800-pound question sitting in the room, and nobody's asked it yet. So you have described to us how ISIS has changed its strategy over time in reaction to various events and so forth. What do you think might be the influence on their thinking with the election of Donald Trump?
So to be clear, they would use any American president to propagandize. If Hillary Clinton had won the election, they would have denigrated her as a woman. They would have found all sorts of things she said over the years to try to demonstrate that she hates Muslims and that they can propagandize in that respect. They did this. They've done this with Obama. They've called him all sorts of racially charged, terrible things that I don't really want to repeat. So there's not going to be some way to mollify the Islamic State. But I think the challenge for us today is multifold. The perception, however you want to understand the recent, administration actions about a ban on immigration from various countries, that is understood around the world as a ban on Muslims. And ISIS will say, we told you so. They will point to Anwar al-Awlaki, who is an American al-Qaeda member that is honored by both ISIS and al-Qaeda, to your point, who warned in 2012 before he was killed, you cannot trust a kind word from your neighbors in the United States. Eventually the camps are coming. They will turn on you. So you better pick up a gun now. That was what al-Awlaki said then. And I guarantee the Islamic State and al-Qaeda propaganda stuff is coming, using that kind of sentiment and saying, look, we warned you, it's coming now, as a way to try to radicalize and incite violence among Muslims living in the West. Now, generally speaking, I don't think that's really going to work very well for them. What I think that some of this is actually going to do more of is it's going to reduce the amount of intelligence that comes in from communities that might be used to head off violence because there's going to be the perception that it would be misused. I think in many cases the specter of torture again is going to reduce intelligence sharing even with our allies, which is one of the great successes of the war on terror era. Generally speaking, is that we try to share information with the British and the French and the Australians and these kind of folks, the Canadians. I think there is risk around that. Hopefully, at an intelligence sharing level, we move past some of the political stuff. But I think that's a real danger. And I think one of the really hard parts here is that in the last year, progress has been being made against the Islamic State. And the Obama administration was very quiet about that. They didn't tout a lot of it, which may have been a mistake. But the only way that progress happens is really careful diplomacy with all of these different factions on the ground in Iraq, all of these factions on the ground in Syria. And that diplomacy is going to be hard, and it's going to have to be very, very careful. And I hope, though I'm not terribly optimistic, that President Trump will be committed to that kind of task. And the problem is if you're not committed to that kind of diplomacy and the kind of very careful horse trading that's necessary to make it work, and recognizing that you swallow some deals that you don't really like along the way. Without that, your options start to get real thin. Your options start to be, well, maybe we have to do this ourselves, which I don't think people really, I don't think anybody would. Even outside Berkeley, people don't want that option, right? Or you kind of have to be sort of a, well, let them shake it out. And I don't think that's a real viable option either. That to me is the biggest thing. It's the impact on the intelligence, and it's the impact on the sort of diplomatic horse trading with all these complex factions in both Syria and Iraq to make these military offensives happen, and to make those things happen with a relatively small commitment of Americans, which and look, I wrote the book in part because some of those Americans are maybe my cadets, and I don't even, my old cadets. That's why they reached out in 2014.
From what we have seen, that level of diplomacy doesn't appear to be the president's strong suit. Can you join me in thanking Brian for
I appreciate that. Can you get one of those shots?